My son and daughter-in-law forbade me from visiting their house for years, always saying it was just a place under renovation. After they died in a supposed accident at sea, their lawyer handed me a key and said, "You should go see the place yourself." I thought I would simply sell it and close that chapter of my life. But when I opened the door, what I found inside wasn't a house at all. It was a hidden laboratory, and the truth about my family nearly took the breath out of me. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. If you opened your child's house and discovered a shocking secret inside, what would you do? Please note, this is a fictional story, and some details are dramatized for storytelling. The brass key felt unnaturally heavy in my palm, a cold weight that didn't just represent an inheritance, but a secret my son and daughter-in-law took to a watery grave. I, Thane Garrison, a 66-year-old retired Coast Guard commander with eyes that had seen too many storms and skin like weathered oak, sat in the silence of the law office as the attorney slid that heavy brass key across the desk. The room smelled of old paper and dust, a sterile environment for such a messy legacy. Across from me sat the estate attorney, a man whose name I had already forgotten, but whose fear was impossible to ignore. He was a professional used to the mundane details of death, yet he could not stop his hands from shaking as he delivered the final instructions from Silas and Rhea. He slid a slip of paper toward me containing GPS coordinates that made no sense. Silas and Rhea were adamant, "Commander." He whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "You go alone." "No, no, Leander. Just you." I frowned, the suspicion rising like a cold tide in my chest. Why the coordinates? My son's property was in the city, not the coast. I knew Silas had claimed that coastal land was worthless scrub, a tax write-off at best. The lawyer's eyes darted toward the door before he leaned in, revealing the true nature of this meeting. Silas and Rhea had left a dead man's switch instruction. The key was only to be delivered to me if I hadn't heard from my daughter about the property's true nature within 6 months of my son and daughter-in-law's funeral. It had been exactly 6 months to the day. Would a man who hated the sea really buy a house perched on its very edge? Or was the ocean just a convenient place for him to disappear? That question haunted me as I walked out of the office and climbed into my old truck. The drive toward Bodega Bay was a gauntlet of gray. A dense, unnatural fog swallowed Highway 1, reducing the world to the salt spray on my windshield and the rhythmic whine of the truck engine. My son and daughter-in-law had been people of science researchers who valued logic above all else. Yet they had lured me out here to a place where landmarks ceased to exist. The GPS led me off the main road and down a private, unmarked path, hidden behind a wall of twisted cypress trees. The branches reached out like skeletal fingers through the mist. The GPS chirped a final mocking command. "You have reached your destination." But all I saw was a wall of gray. I pulled the truck to a stop before a massive iron gate. The muffled silence of the fog was absolute, pressing against my eardrums until the blood hammered in my temples. I stepped out of the cab, expecting to find a rusted relic of a gate, a testament to the worthless lot Silas had described. Instead, as I reached for the lock, my fingers came away slick. The mechanism had been freshly oiled, the metal gleaming despite the damp air. I looked down at the gravel drive. There, preserved in the moist earth, were fresh tire tracks leading inside. I recognized those tire treads. They were the exact width of my son-in-law's Mercedes, and the engine was still ticking in the silence of the fog. I gripped the iron handle of my service pistol through my jacket pocket, my boots crunching on gravel that had been disturbed only minutes ago. The mist was so thick it felt like wet wool against my face, but the heat coming from those fresh tire tracks was undeniable. I followed the indentations past a wall of wind-twisted cypress trees toward the sprawling cedar structure Silas had always called a dilapidated investment. My eyes scanned for the glint of a luxury sedan, expecting to see Leander's car parked arrogantly at the front door, but the driveway was empty. It didn't make sense. The tracks I was certain belonged to my son-in-law's Mercedes ended abruptly in a square of concrete that looked too clean for this part of the coast. As I stepped onto the pad, I noticed the faint oily seams of a hidden hydraulic lift. The car hadn't just left. It had been swallowed underground. A strange, lingering scent of ozone hung in the heavy air, a sharp contrast to the natural rot of the salt marsh. The house loomed out of the Bodega Bay fog, its windows dark and reflective like obsidian mirrors, watching me approach with a cold, predatory gaze. I stood there for a moment, listening to the muffled sound of my own heartbeat, wondering what kind of people build a fortress and call it a shack. I pulled the heavy brass key from my pocket. I expected the resistance of a rusted bolt or the groan of a neglected hinge. But the moment I turned the metal, the door glided open on silent industrial bearings. You have to understand, a house on this coast should smell like salt and rot. This place smelled like a surgical suite. The foyer was a jarring transition from the rugged Soma exterior. There was no sawdust from the supposed renovations had mentioned, and no exposed beams waiting for a carpenter's touch. Instead, I found a hall paneled in tempered glass and white cedar, pristine, and smelling of high-grade hospital antiseptic and lemon oil. My boots felt heavy and filthy on the white floors. Silas, Rhea, what the hell were you two building out here? The question was a whisper that died instantly in the acoustic tiled ceiling. I moved deeper into the corridor, my hand still resting on the weapon in my pocket. The cold touch of tempered glass met my shoulder as I navigated a turn toward what should have been the kitchen. The silence in the hallway wasn't the silence of an empty house. It was the hum of a predator holding its breath. Every light was recessed, casting a shadowless glow that made the air feel thin, almost pressurized. I reached a digital security panel mounted by the kitchen entrance, its sleek black surface contrasting with the wood. There was no keypad, only a glowing glass plate designed for a biometric scan. My hand hovered over it, an instinctive rejection of the technology. But curiosity won over caution. I pressed my thumb against the glass, expecting a red rejection light and a siren. Instead, the screen flickered to life, displaying a line of text that sent a chill through my marrow. Emergency authorization, Commander Garrison. My thumbprint had been registered before Silas and Rhea died. The panel beeped green and the entire wall of the library began to slide back with the hiss of a pressurized seal revealing a world my son and daughter-in-law had died to keep in the dark. I stepped through the threshold, my hand instinctively going to the small of my back, but the sight before me didn't require a weapon. It required a miracle. The pressurized seal of the hidden library wall finished its hiss, leaving me standing in a state-of-the-art pediatric ward that gleamed with chrome and soft recessed lighting. This wasn't a basement clinic. It was a billion-dollar fortress. 3 beds occupied the center of the room, each one a cocoon of advanced medical technology that looked far more sophisticated than anything I had seen in standard university hospitals. The air was thick with the sterile scent of ozone and antiseptic, a sharp tang that sat on my tongue like the metallic taste of adrenaline. As I walked deeper into the sanctuary of steel and glass, I noticed something that stopped me cold. One of the high-pressure ventilators humming beside the nearest bed, or a small etched brass seal from my own former Coast Guard unit. It was specialized search and rescue equipment that had been reported lost at sea during a training exercise 5 years ago. Silas and Rhea hadn't just been building a lab. They had been scavenging, pulling resources from the shadows to create this place. The silence of the room was broken only by the rhythmic hiss of ventilators and the soft melodic chime of heart monitors casting a cold glow of blue LED light across the pristine floor. I felt a dawning realization that the son and daughter-in-law I thought I knew were only fragments of the people who had lived within these white walls. How many lives had been bought and sold within these white walls? While I was busy thinking my son had just become another cold-hearted city doctor. The soft hum of industrial air filtration seemed to mock my ignorance. Suddenly, a woman in a lab coat emerged from a side lab, her face a mask of exhausted ferocity. Dr. Lean Sterling, 44, a bioinformatics researcher with gray stray hair pulled into a tight bun, emerged from the shadows of the lab with a look of desperate hope that quickly sharpened into a threat. She pointed a small security remote at me with the steady grip of someone holding a detonator. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice thin but sharp. "I've already alerted the silent alarm." "Who sent you? Was it Farm Armacore?" I held my ground, keeping my hands visible. but away from my weapon, my voice carrying the calm authority of decades on a quarterdeck. I'm Thane Garrison. Silas was my son. Rhea was my daughter-in-law. And I think you're the reason they were looking over their shoulders for 3 years. Her defensive posture softened slightly at the mention of their names, her thumb easing off the button. She looked me up and down, searching for a family resemblance in the dim light. I could see the suspicion battling with her exhaustion. She lowered the remote slightly, but her eyes remained wary, tracking every move I made. This wasn't just about security. It was about survival. She stepped closer, the blue light of the monitors catching the lines of stress around her mouth. "You need to understand something, Commander," she said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. "That silent alarm I mentioned. It isn't connected to the local police. It's linked to an offshore server. If I don't enter a safe code every 30 minutes, the entire research database, everything Silas and Rhea died for, is wiped from existence." She lowered the remote entirely, her eyes searching mine for a lie before she whispered, "Silas said you'd come eventually. He said you were the only one who could navigate the storm that's coming." I watched the monitor flicker to life, my pulse hammering against my ribs as the faces of my dead son and daughter-in-law materialized through the digital static, their eyes reaching out from the grave. "Doctor." Sterling worked the console with a clinical speed that suggested she had played this footage 1,000 times. The blue light of the monitor reflected in my weathered eyes, making the deep lines of my face look like a map of a territory I no longer recognized. On the dusty television screen, Silas Garrison, a 41-year-old pediatric cardiologist, with a weary but warm smile, looked into the camera as if he knew he was recording his own eulogy. Beside him sat Rhea Garrison, 39, a forensic pathologist with a gaze as sharp as a scalpel, her hand resting firmly on Silas's in a silent oath of solidarity. Silas took a breath, his voice steady despite the grainy digital texture of the recording. "Dad, if you're seeing this," the fog finally caught us, "don't look for us. Look for the children." He explained the Protocol 7 medical rebellion, detailing how they had moved their research underground when Farm Armacore attempted to buy and bury their cure for pediatric neuroblastoma. Rhea spoke, then her voice thick with the memory of our lost granddaughter. "Edith, we aren't just doctors anymore. Thane, we're fugitives from a system that puts quarterly profits above a 6-year-old's heartbeat. We chose this path so other families wouldn't have to suffer our tragedy." Dr. Sterling leaned over the terminal, her voice a low rasp. "This wasn't just a stored file. Commander, this was being live-streamed to a secure satellite during the accident. Silas and Rhea knew exactly what was happening as the boat went down. They made sure the truth survived, even if they didn't. How many times had I sat at Sunday dinner with the very man who might have been counting the minutes until my son and daughter-in-law's lungs filled with salt water? The thought was a physical blow, more painful than any storm I had ever weathered at sea. The video took a darker turn as Silas revealed he and Rhea had been under constant surveillance. He warned that someone within our family circle had been leaking their coordinates to Farm Armacore. He mentioned a broker, a shadow figure bridging the gap between white-collar consulting and black market enforcement. I watched my son's composed facade crack for a split second, revealing the sheer terror of a man who knew his time was running out. They offered us a golden parachute to walk away. Silas set his eyes unfocused. "When we burned the bridge, they decided to burn the boat. Check the foundations. Dad, the rot is closer than you think." The icy chill of the lab's air conditioning felt like the touch of a corpse against my skin. The smell of stale coffee and ozone seemed to thicken, making it hard to draw a full breath. My son and daughter-in-law didn't die of a storm. They died of greed. I leaned closer to the screen, freezing the frame, until the pixels screamed in protest of the magnification. As the camera had panned slightly during the final moments, it caught a blurred reflection in the window behind Silas. It was distant, partially obscured by the Bodega Bay spray, but the silhouette was unmistakable. I recognized the distinct silver trim of a black powerboat, a frequent rental used by my son-in-law, Leander Mercer. It was idling just outside the kill zone, watching the Garrison name sink into the deep. The rage was a cold, familiar anchor in my chest. But as doctor, Sterling led me toward the glass partition of the ward. It was replaced by a hollow, aching sense of duty. I turned away from the frozen video screen. The image of Leander's silver-trimmed boat burned into my retinas like a brand. My hands were steady, a discipline earned from decades on the quarterdeck. But my mind was a storm. Doctor, Sterling didn't give me time to drown in the grief. She pulled up the encrypted protocol 7 data on a secondary tablet, the blue-white glare of the survival charts reflecting in the sterile glass. She explained that Silas and Rhea hadn't just found a treatment. They had engineered a way to trigger a systemic immune response that decimated neuroblast cells with an unprecedented 87% success rate. It was a miracle in a world of zero care. However, the victory was fragile. She revealed that the therapy isn't just a drug. It's a living cellular treatment derived from Silas and Rhea's unique genetic markers combined through their research. This meant the cure literally died with them unless the stored samples in this facility are protected at all costs. My son and daughter-in-law weren't just doctors, I whispered, staring at the soaring success curves on the monitor. They were revolutionaries. Statistics are just numbers until one of them looks you in the eye and asks for a cookie. I felt that truth the moment we stepped into the clinical ward. The air here changed, smelling of sterile lavender and apple juice rather than ozone. I was introduced to 7-year-old Ren, a patient who is thriving despite being sent home to die by mainstream hospitals. She sat upright in her bed with a defiant spark in her eyes, meticulously coloring a picture of a lighthouse. Unlike the frail, shadowed child I had prepared myself to see, she looked remarkably vibrant. When she looked up at me, her gaze was bright and clear, lacking the glazed fog of heavy sedation. The hum of her advanced heart monitor was a rhythmic, healthy pulse in the quiet room. "Are you Dr. Silas and Dr. Rhea's daddy?" she asked, her voice small but certain. "You have the same sad eyes." I knelt beside her bed, my knees popping with the weight of my ears. The medical ward wasn't a room. It was a lifeboat in a vast dark sea, and I was the only one left at the oars. I reached out, feeling the warmth of her small, sticky hand as she pressed a crayon into my palm. "Dr. Silas and Dr. Rhea promised me I'd see the ocean soon," she said. "I'm here to finish what they started." "Sweetheart," I replied, and I felt the mantle of protector settle over my shoulders like a lead shroud. "I promise." Ren smiled and held up the drawing she had been working on. It wasn't just a simple lighthouse. It was a detailed map of the Bodega Bay coastline drawn with a precision that chilled me. In the corner, a dark X was marked on a specific underwater cave system I knew intimately from my days patrolling these cliffs. I stared at the X on Ren's drawing, the exact location where my son and daughter-in-law's boat had allegedly capsized. And I realized Silas and Rhea hadn't left me a map of their death, but a coordinate for their survival. I pulled a heavy leather-bound ledger from the shelf, my thumb brushing against the same Coast Guard seal I'd worn for 30 years, and realized my son and daughter-in-law hadn't just been keeping a secret. They'd been building a fortress. I retreated to the absolute stillness of Silas and Rhea's private office. The door ceiling shut behind me with a muted thud that echoed in my chest. The room smelled of old leather and ozone, a scent that had become the hallmark of this hidden world. I sat at their mahogany desk and began a systematic audit of the facility's archives, my hands steady, even as my mind reeled from the coordinate Ren had shared. I cross-referenced the physical patient logs with high-grade medication shipments stored on a bluish glowing encrypted monitor. As I dove deeper, the sheer scale of the operation began to paralyze me. Over the last 5 years, Silas and Rhea had treated 63 children in absolute secrecy. Each file was a testament to a miracle containing recovery charts that defied every standard oncological projection I had ever studied. "My God, Silas, Rhea," I whispered to the empty room. "You weren't just doctors. You were ghosts in the machine." But as I flipped through the list of names, a chilling pattern emerged that made the metallic tang of cold coffee in my mouth turn to copper. Every child Silas and Rhea treated was the son or daughter of a high-ranking employee or board member at Farm Armacore. They hadn't just been healing them, they had been using their own children as leverage, a human shield to keep the corporation from striking back too early. Turning these pages was like navigating a minefield. Every name was a detonator, and I was walking through it in heavy boots. I felt the dry crinkle of high-grade vellum paper beneath my fingers, each page turning with a sound like a stifled gasp. Beyond the local files, I found an encrypted map detailing supply lines that stretched like a spiderweb from Switzerland to Singapore. This worthless scrubland in Bodega Bay was the central hub for a global network of rogue medical professionals. The scale was staggering, far beyond a simple family rebellion. This isn't a clinic. I realized the weight of the paper feeling like lead in my hands. It's a declaration of war. How do you protect a miracle when the entire world wants to profit from its death? The distant, rhythmic crashing of waves against the bodega cliffs sounded like the drums of an approaching army. I was no longer just a grieving father. I was a commander in a war I hadn't known was being fought. I reached the very back of the ledger where the handwriting became more hurried, more frantic. I found a payroll entry for logistics and security made out to a shell company I didn't recognize at first. But as I cross-referenced the tax ID, my blood turned to ice. It was the same shell company Leander Mercer uses for his offshore accounts, the one he thinks I don't know about. I stared at Leander's signature on the security payroll and felt the cold realization that my son-in-law hadn't just stumbled onto this property. He had been part of the security detail since the very beginning. A fox paid to guard the hen house while he mapped out the kill. I closed the heavy ledger and sat on the porch at dawn, the metal key still heavy in my pocket. I didn't need to see the license plate to know it was her. The aggressive crunch of tires on gravel was a sound I'd learned to associate with a rival whenever she wanted something I wasn't ready to give. Aara Mercer, 36, a senior grant administrator whose expensive silk scarf couldn't hide the tension in her throat, walked toward the house with the hurried air of someone trying to stay ahead of a lie. The sharp sting of the morning air usually cleared my head, but today it only heightened the bitter smell of burnt coffee lingering on the porch. She skipped the pleasantries, the metallic clicking of her heels sounding like a countdown on the floorboards. "Dad, be reasonable." She started, her eyes darting toward the Bodega Bay fog. "That house is rotting on the cliff. Leander has already found a buyer willing to pay above market value in cash. He can make this problem go away by Monday." I watched her hands. She was shredding a paper napkin into tiny, jagged flakes, a clinical sign of extreme financial stress I'd seen in 100 subordinates facing court-martial. "I'm not selling a memory for a quick commission." "Aara," I replied, my voice carrying the undercurrent of authority she always hated, especially not one Silas and Rhea died to protect. As I spoke, I noticed a small lapel pin on her blazer, a stylized caduceus from a high-end medical consultancy firm. My stomach turned. It was the exact same logo I had seen on the Protocol 7 opposition files in Silas and Rhea's lab just hours ago. Desperation has a specific scent. It smells like cheap perfume and expensive lies. All leaned in closer, her voice rising. "We have a deadline. Dad, we can't just sit on this." "A deadline?" I asked, leaning back. "Who set a deadline on my son and daughter-in-law's house? There is no such thing in probate law." Her face went ghostly pale, the blood retreating as if I'd struck her. She checked her phone for the third time in a minute, her hand shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. How much is a daughter's loyalty worth when her husband is drowning in a sea of red ink? The question hung in the silence between us, punctuated only by the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn. When I mentioned Leander's specific background in logistics and security, she didn't even try to lie. She simply fumbled for her keys, her movements erratic and panicked. "It doesn't matter." She snapped already, backing away. "Just think about it for the sake of this family." "Dad, please." She fled to her car, the engine roaring to life with a desperate whine. I stood there watching the red glow of her taillights vanish into the mist. I reached under the small wicker table where she'd been leaning and felt something out of place. My fingers brushed against the cold plastic texture of a hidden recording bug. I pulled it free. A tiny high-frequency device that proved she wasn't just here to talk. She was there to gather evidence of my instability to justify a forced sale. I held the tiny black bug in the palm of my hand and looked toward the Bodega Bay fog. Knowing the vultures weren't just circling, they had already landed. I spread the autopsy photos and the maritime logs across my desk, my eyes scanning the data with the practiced precision of a man who had spent 30 years pulling bodies from the wreckage of accidents that weren't accidents at all. The study was thick with the smell of stale toner and old paper, a scent that usually grounded me. But today, it felt like the dry breath of a tomb. My attention was fixed on the official Coast Guard accident report from the day Silas and Rhea died. I cross-referenced the reported wave heights and wind speeds with the specific keel design of my son's 34-foot Catalina. The logs claimed a sudden squall had overwhelmed the vessel, yet the data told a different story. A 12-knot gust doesn't flip a boat of that class. Silas, Rhea. I whispered my analytical focus, sharpening into a cold, hard fury. Not with the ballast you were carrying. I knew that boat. I'd helped them rig it. As I dug into the signature on the initial clear report, I found a name that made the metallic tang of blood rise in the back of my throat. N.N. Miller. He was a junior officer I had personally discharged for taking bribes from commercial tours years ago. Seeing his name on the sign-off was a confession in itself. He was exactly the kind of lowlife Leander Mercer would have on a permanent payroll to make inconvenient truths disappear. The ocean never lies. People do. I moved from the logs to the high-resolution forensic photos of the bodies. The grainy, pixelated texture of the images on my screen blurred for a moment as I fought back a wave of grief. But I forced my eyes to stay open. I ignored the water damage and the pale, bloated skin, focusing instead on the deep circumferential bruising around their wrists and ankles. The medical examiner had labeled these as impact trauma from hitting the rigging during the capsize. But I'd seen enough maritime violence to know better. Rigging doesn't leave clean, perfect circles. You lying bastards. These were the specific tension marks left by heavy-duty nylon zip ties. You tied them to their own ship before the hull ever touched the water. How many other accidents had Farm Armacore paid for to keep their billion-dollar chemo monopoly afloat? The question hammered in my head alongside the low hum of the desktop computer. I checked the GPS log again and found a massive discrepancy. The boat had been scuttled in a deep water trench where the wreckage was never intended to be found. The plan was for them to vanish into the silt, but a local current shift, one that only a seasoned navigator would have anticipated, had pushed the bodies toward the shore 3 days later than the killers had planned. Their own hubris had left me the evidence I needed. I leaned back, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for a magnifying glass. I looked back at the photo of my son's wrist, then at the grainy surveillance photo of the rental boat Leander had taken out from the marina that same day. I zoomed in on the deck of the powerboat, and there it was, sitting in a messy coil near the transom. It was a length of the exact same blue fleck nylon rope that had left the signature on Silas and Rhea's skin. The vultures hadn't just landed. They had left their calling card in the very rigging of the murder. I didn't wait for the bell above the door to stop chiming before I locked eyes with the pharmacist, my hand heavy in my pocket on the folder of autopsy reports that proved he'd been sending my son more than just vitamins. The clinical powdery smell of the pharmacy was a thin veil over the rot I was starting to uncover in this town. Miller, the town's local pharmacist, with nervous eyes and hands stained yellow from chemicals, stood behind the counter like a man waiting for a sentencing. The squeak of my boots on the linoleum sounded like a jury's verdict in the absolute silence of the shop. I didn't bother with a greeting. I laid out a list of high-grade oncology compounds I'd found in Silas's lab and watched Miller's face go the color of chalk. Silas was a good man. Thing. He stammered, his yellowed fingers twitching against the register. I was just helping the kids. We both knew he was lying. Good men don't ask you to cook the books. Miller, I said, my voice dropping into the low, disciplined frequency of a commander's interrogation. They don't have to. I watched his composure dissolve. His breathing became shallow. and he started to sweat the moisture beading on his forehead, despite the air conditioning. He knew exactly what I was holding evidence that his license and his freedom were now on my desk. Miller looked at the door, then signaled for me to follow him into the back office. The shift was sudden, a transition from public denial to private desperation. He revealed that Silas wasn't just buying medicine. He was returning samples of the Protocol 7 serum for Miller to hide in a temperature-controlled vault under the floorboards, fearing a raid at the estate. In this town, the fog hides the houses, but the ledger hides the sins. Miller pulled out a yellowed, curling, handwritten ledger that had never touched the digital system. He explained that Silas was paying 3 times the market rate, but the money didn't come from Silas's accounts. It came via courier. Miller described a specific interaction where a man in an expensive suit matching Leander's description perfectly hand-delivered a cash premium to ensure certain vials remained untraceable. The tall one with the Mercedes. He told me it was all part of a corporate-sponsored trial. Miller whispered, his eyes darting to the security monitor. He was buying your silence. Miller, I replied, a cold resolve hardening in my chest. And my son's life was the tax. How many miracles were sitting in a basement while my son-in-law was upstairs counting the cash for their destruction? The realization sat like lead in my stomach. Miller knelt and pried up a section of the floor, revealing the cold metal of the hidden vault handle. As the door creaked open, the smell of ozone and medicine wafted up. But it was the small white scrap of paper attached to the last shipment that stopped my heart. I reached down and picked it up. Leander is asking about the cold storage. Don't tell him. The note was written in Ria's panicked, frantic handwriting, the jagged slant of the letters, a scream from the past. It was dated the day before they died. I pocketed Ria's note, the paper still smelling faintly of her lavender perfume, and realized that my daughter-in-law hadn't just been a victim. She'd been the one holding the line against her own family. I didn't just walk back into that house. I boarded it like a hostile vessel, my eyes scanning the baseboards and crown molding for the one thing Silas and Ria would have hidden, whereas bugs couldn't reach. The heavy mahogany door of the estate groaned as it swung shut, sealing me into a silence that tasted of salt air and ozone. Ria's note was still pressed against my thigh, a reminder that the woman I'd treated like a daughter-in-law had been a sentry at the gate of her own execution. I felt a grim determination settling over me, the kind of icy focus that usually preceded a boarding action in the middle of a gale. I pulled a vibrating signal detector from my kit, a piece of hardware I'd kept from my final tour in the Coast Guard, and began a tactical sweep of the library. I ignored the high-tech gleam of the pediatric ward, focusing instead on the structural dead zones where electrical interference spiked. My boots echoed on the white cedar floors as I moved toward the heavy mahogany desk. I knelt, the metallic click of the floorboard being pried up, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. Beneath the wood lay a waterproof Pelican case. Inside, I found a cheap prepaid burner phone and a handwritten list of maritime frequencies. I scrolled through the outgoing texts and felt a new, sharper kind of grief. Silas and Ria had sent dozens of messages to Aala's private number that night, pleading with her to stop Leander before it was too late. They had begged her to call off the associates Leander was bringing to the boat. She never answered. Not once. Silas and Ria's voices were ghosts caught in a plastic cage, screaming against a tide that had already won. I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the phone's small blue screen, and pressed play on the final saved message. The audio was static heavy, a distorted rasp of Silas's voice fighting against the roar of wind and crashing waves. Dad, if you find this, we tried to warn you. Leander isn't just a gambler. He's the cleaner. He's been selling our locations for months. The sound of a struggle erupted in the background, the heavy thud of boots on a deck and the hiss of salt spray. I can hear them coming up the ladder. Silas whispered, his voice cracking with a visceral horror. Tell Aara. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't save her from him. How does a father listen to his son and daughter-in-law's last breath and still call himself a protector? The absolute suffocating silence of the library after the recording ended was worse than the sound of the fight. I sat there paralyzed, the phone vibrating with a residual electronic hum in my palm. The voicemail didn't end with silence. Though, as I played the last few seconds again, I heard the distinct electronic chirp of the same high-frequency bug I'd found on my own porch. The killers hadn't just murdered my son and daughter-in-law. They had recorded the entire act as a proof of performance for Farm Armacore, a digital receipt for a job well done. I closed my eyes, the darkness of the room matching the darkness in my soul. But then, beneath the sounds of the struggle and the mechanical chirp on the tape, a third voice spoke. It was a low clinical murmur that didn't belong to Silas or Leander. A voice that whispered a name that made my blood turn to slush. The marina at 2 a.m. was a cemetery of masts and creaking wood, the kind of place where secrets are drowned in the tide. But I wasn't there to mourn. I was there to dig up a ghost. The cold, damp air of the coast clung to my jacket. As I navigated the slippery docks, the smell of diesel fuel and rotting kelp thick enough to coat my throat. My mind was still reeling from the audio I'd recovered from the burner phone. That third voice, the one whispering commands over the sound of the ocean, hadn't belonged to some corporate hitman. It was the same dry, precise tone of the attorney who had handed me the brass key in Sacramento. The legal inheritance hadn't been an act of my son's foresight. It had been a baited hook, a setup to watch me walk right into their surveillance net. I reached the security shack, the rhythmic slapping of water against the mossy piling sounding like a slow, steady heartbeat. Elias, a weathered dockhand with hands like cracked leather and eyes heavy with a debt he could never repay, led me into the flickering light of the security shed. He looked older than he was a man, ground down by life until Silas had stepped in to save his boy. "Your son is breathing because of Silas, Elias," I said, my voice carrying the weight of a debt that didn't need naming. "I need the raw logs from Slip 42. He didn't ask questions. He knew the official investigation was a whitewash that only tracked the main channel. "Thane, if they catch me, I'm done," he whispered. But he was already pulling out a ring of keys. "Silas gave us everything. Follow me." We moved into the cramped server room, the low-frequency hum of cooling fans filling the air. Cameras don't have a conscience. They just have a memory. I sat before the grainy green-tinted flicker of the infrared monitor, my eyes narrowing as I pulled up the footage from the night of the storm. I watched Silas's sailboat glide out of the harbor, a small white ghost in a world of shadows. 10 minutes later, a low-profile, blacked-out powerboat detached itself from a private slip. It moved with a predatory grace, carrying no running lights, and sitting deep in the water, the mark of a reinforced hull built for a high-speed intercept in a rolling swell. The black boat on the screen moved like a parasite latched onto the wake of my son's life. I watched the clock on the screen crawl forward, my pulse thawing in my ears. 3 hours passed in a digital blur until the shadow vessel returned to the pier. My hand froze on the playback dial. As the boat nudged against the dock, the infrared camera caught a clear, high-contrast shot of the driver removing a tactical mask. It was Leander, just as I'd suspected. But he wasn't alone. I watched as stepped onto the pier behind him. She wasn't weeping. She wasn't the grieving widow she'd pretended to be for 6 months. She was carrying Silas's encrypted laptop, clutching it to her chest like a trophy won in blood. I froze the frame on's face as she stepped onto the pier, her expression not one of grief, but of cold, calculated victory as she handed my son's life's work to the man who had just killed him. The betrayal was absolute, a perfect circle of rot that started at my own dinner table. I slid the encrypted drive into my pocket, the plastic edge biting into my thigh like a reminder that I was no longer just a grieving father. I was a walking crime scene. I moved quickly through the marina parking lot, the rhythmic, distant ticking of a wall clock in the guard shack, echoing the frantic pace of my thoughts. Once inside my truck, the smell of ozone and motor oil from the garage clung to my clothes, a tactile ghost of the investigation. I powered up my laptop, the blue-white glare of the screen washing over my face in the darkness. I needed to verify the ghost that had rented that black powerboat. I used the truck's secure satellite link to cross-reference the alias David Morrison found on the marina rental receipt. It didn't take long for the cold truth to surface. The identity was a patchwork of stolen data built using the social security number of a deceased Coast Guard veteran who had served under me 2 decades ago. My pulse hammered in my temples. You used one of my own men to kill my son. Leander, you didn't just cross a line, you burned it. He'd been mining my personal service records, desecrating the memory of the dead to create untraceable shell personas. As the decryption software finished its work on the Marina files, a secondary notification pinged. The data revealed an active GPS signal from Silas's laptop, the one I had just watched Aara carry off the pier. The tracker showed it was currently powered on the signal localized inside in Leander's master bedroom. The morning sun wasn't a sign of hope. It was a spotlight hitting the wreckage of my family. Seeing that ping felt like a physical violation. I sat there in the cab, the cold, damp fog pressing against the windows as I watched that little green dot pulse on the map. My daughter didn't just ignore the texts. She sold the phone. She sat in her house with the spoils of a murder while I was left to sift through the ashes. I drove back home as the sun began to bleed through the gray Bodega Bay mist. I didn't go to the kitchen for coffee. I went straight to my basement study. I retreated to the far corner and opened a heavy fireproof safe hidden behind a false workbench. I meticulously cataloged the day's haul, the digital drive, the verified alias report, and Ria's lavender-scented note. This isn't enough for a courtroom yet. I muttered, my voice sounding hollow in the small room. Not with their lawyers. I need the money trail. If I went to the local police now, the Farm Armacore connections would ensure this evidence disappeared before it ever reached a judge's bench. I had to be the investigator, the prosecutor, and the jury. As I reorganized the rental boat agreement, my fingers brushed a seam I hadn't noticed before. I peeled back a hidden compartment in the back of the paperwork and found a digital signature from the Farm Armacore Security Division. It was an explicit authorization for the retrieval of proprietary biological assets. They hadn't just been hunting Silas, they had been checking boxes on a corporate balance sheet. I slammed the safe door shut and spun the dial, the heavy thud of the bolts echoing in the empty house like a hammer on a coffin nail. The sound was final. The man who had entered this study was gone, replaced by a commander preparing for his final engagement. How much does it cost to buy a man's soul and have him murder his own family? According to the numbers appearing on my secure monitor, the price of my son and daughter-in-law's lives was exactly $500,000. I sat in the oppressive silence of my basement study, the heavy thud of the safe bolts from moments ago, still vibrating in the back of my mind. The dark room was illuminated only by the green glow of the terminal reflecting in my glasses, casting long skeletal shadows against the false workbench. My fingers moved with a rhythmic tapping across the keys as I initiated a secure channel to a ghost from my past. Red had been a lead forensic accountant for the Coast Guard Investigative Service before he decided that the dark web offered a more honest living. I fed him Leander's social security number and the shell company name I'd unearthed from Silas and Ria's secret ledger. I need a full financial autopsy on Leander Mercer. I typed, my jaw tight. Start with the David Morrison alias. The metallic smell of the computer tower's cooling fans filled the small space while I waited. Red's response appeared in a scrolling blur of crimson text. Thane. This guy isn't just in debt. He's underwater in a trench. He's been bleeding out for years. I watched a progress bar crawl across the screen as Red bypassed the firewalls of offshore gambling sites and predatory equity firms. The truth that emerged was a staggering portrait of greed. Leander had acquired a massive $850,000 debt, not through bad luck, but through a calculated gamble. He had purchased heavy short sale options against Farm Armacore stock. He wasn't just working for them. He was betting that the company would crash the moment he delivered Silas and Ria's research to be buried forever. Leander's bank statements read like a suicide note written in ink and greed. He had lost everything on high-stakes offshore baccarat and failed commercial real estate flips. He was a man with a noose around his neck, and he decided to use my son and daughter-in-law's lives as the stool to stand on. You want to know the difference between a predator and a father? A predator knows exactly what your life is worth in cash. A father doesn't realize there's a price tag until he's looking at a wire transfer. Red hit the mother lode at midnight. A dossier arrived itemizing a $500,000 deposit from Aegis Strategic Consulting, a notorious Pharma front. It hit Leander's account exactly 72 hours after the boat went down. $500,000. I whispered to the cold walls. That's what a successful assassination looks like on a balance sheet. But the sudden sharp chill of realization didn't stop there. As I dug deeper into the decrypted files, red highlighted a secondary account. It was a private offshore ledger in Aara's name. It had been receiving a monthly stipend of $10,000 from that same Aegis shell company for over a year before Silas and Rhea ever died. My breath hitched the air in the basement, suddenly feeling too thin to support life. I stared at Aara's name on that monthly stipend, the dates matching perfectly with every holiday she'd spent away from us. And I realized my daughter hadn't just been a victim of Leander's manipulation. She had been on their payroll since the beginning. She wasn't just covering for her husband. She was an active participant in the corporate surveillance that had pinned Silas and Rhea like butterflies to a board. I bypassed the front door, slipping through the ventilation service hatch with a cold efficiency that would have made my old training instructors proud and my son terrified. The estate above was silent, but down here in the belly of the Bodega Bay facility, the dry, stale air of the server room tasted of static and ancient secrets. I moved through the shadows with icy tactical detachment, the revelations of Aara's betrayal sitting in my stomach like lead. I reached the primary server stack, tucked discreetly behind the hum of the cryogenic storage units. The blue flicker of server LEDs danced across my knuckles as I pulled a military-grade encryption bridge from my pack. My fingers steady despite the adrenaline navigated the cold, slick texture of the Ethernet cables as I forced a hardwired connection into the terminal. The rhythmic whirring of cooling fans was the only sound in the dark. This stays in the light now. Silas, I whispered to the empty room. No more shadows. I initiated the mirroring process, watching the transfer bar begin its slow crawl across the screen. Every gigabyte of Protocol 7 data moved to the decentralized cloud was a nail in Pharmacor's corporate coffin. However, the system balked, the screen flashing amber. A secondary biometric override was required. Not just my thumbprint, but a scan from a living patient. 0. I stared at the prompt, realizing Silas had tied the very survival of his research to Ren. The server room breathed with a low electric growl, the heartbeat of a secret that had already cost too many lives. I bypassed the physical scan by injecting the baseline biometric signature from Ren's local medical file, a move that felt like a surgical strike against my son's own failsafes. The transfer resumed the smell of ozone and overheated copper thickening as the processors strained. Data is weightless. Yet, it felt like I was carrying the bodies of everyone we'd lost on my shoulders. Suddenly, the lights in the lab flickered. The internal sensors had detected the unsanctioned backup and were attempting to initiate a localized purge. I fought back, my hands flying across the keys to override the deletion protocol, essentially tricking the facility into believing this was an authorized maintenance cycle. Come on, you digital bastard. Just 5 more minutes, I hissed, watching the percentage climb. A cold sweat broke across my neck when the power fluctuated again. This wasn't just a system error. The facility was being remotely accessed from an external node. I checked the access logs, my blood turning to slush as I read the entry from 6 months ago. Someone had attempted to download the protocol's 7 core files exactly 4 hours before the boating accident using administrative credentials. She hadn't just been on the payroll, she had been the one who opened the door for the executioners. I watched the final few megabytes sink, my jaw clamped shut so tight my teeth ached. The betrayal was a living thing now documented in timestamp code. I prepared to disconnect, but the terminal chirped with a final unsolicited notification. As the final byte transferred, a new file appeared on the screen titled with my granddaughter's name and a countdown timer that was already at 0. The folder icon pulsed a warning, read a digital ghost waiting for its moment to speak. I reached for the drive, but my eyes were drawn to the security monitor in the corner. Through the grain of the night vision feed, I saw the unmistakable crimson glow of an SUV's brake lights at the perimeter gate. The ghost file named after my granddaughter was still decriting when the thermal sensors on the north gate spiked two heat signatures that didn't belong to the local deer population. I switched the lab's auxiliary monitors to the external feed. The grainy green glow of the thermal monitors illuminating a blacked-out SUV idling without lights at the end of the Cypress Line Drive. My years in the Coast Guard kicked in a cold, clinical calm, settling over me as I analyzed the vehicle's tactical modifications through the grain. It had the reinforced bumpers and run-flat tires common in high-end private security details. Farm Armacore wasn't just monitoring this property from a distance anymore. They were positioned for a dynamic entry. I zoomed in on the license plate, the digital enhancement software humming in the silence. The registration came back to a holding company I recognized instantly from the financial dossier Red had sent me earlier. It was a subsidiary of Leander's firm. The security Leander had provided Silas wasn't a shield. It was a surveillance net designed to tighten the moment the corporate masters gave the word, "You're late to the party." "Boys," I whispered to the flickering screen, "the data is already in the wind. A black SUV in a white fog is a shadow with teeth." And I knew exactly how sharp those teeth could be. I initiated a localized dark mode for the facility's exterior, cutting the perimeter lights to bleed the landscape into a uniform gray that would baffle their night vision. I packed the encrypted bridge and Ria's original notes into my jacket, the weight of the drive feeling like a live grenade against my ribs. I had to move. I watched the monitor one last time as a man in a tactical headset stepped out of the vehicle, his red dot laser sight sweeping the cypress trees as he moved to inspect the gate lock I'd recently oiled. How many times had Leander sat at my table while his associates were outside mapping the path to my son's murder? The thought was a physical weight, but I pushed it aside, choosing tactical focus over the luxury of rage. I retreated toward the back of the lab, entering a narrow, damp drainage tunnel that Silas had meticulously mapped out as an emergency exfiltration route. The claustrophobic smell of wet concrete and old earth pressed in on me as I moved the only sound, the rhythmic thud of waves against the cliffs outside. My boots made no sound on the slime-slicked floor. I crawled through the darkness, the air getting colder and saltier until the tunnel opened onto a narrow ledge above the surf. The cold bite of sea spray hit my face like a slap. I climbed down to the beach, the sand sucking at my boots in the dark. I scanned the shoreline, expecting to be alone with the tide, but then I stopped. There, illuminated by the faint moon, was a fresh set of footprints leading away from the water and straight toward the tunnel entrance I had just exited. They were small, distinct, and fresh. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at the footprints in the wet sand, then back at the house and realized the call wasn't just coming from inside the family, it was coming from inside the building. Someone else had breached the perimeter before I ever arrived, and they were still in there with the ghosts of my family. The world came back to me in jagged, nauseating shards, the smell of stale urine, the bite of a San Francisco wind, and the terrifying realization that I couldn't remember my own middle name. I lay on the cold, damp wood of a park bench, the spinning neon lights of Union Square blurring into a chaotic mess of electric violet and sickly yellow. My motor skills failed as I tried to push myself upright, my limbs feeling like leaden weights attached to a mind that was half submerged in a chemical swamp. The metallic bitter taste of a sedative sat heavy on the back of my tongue. I reached up to rub my neck, my fingers brushing against a small circular bruise. Not a mark from a struggle, but the telltale site where a medical-grade sedative patch had been applied while I was unconscious. I had been professionally handled, moved like cargo from the Bodega Bay shoreline to the heart of the city while the world slept. I fumbled for my pockets, finding them hollow. My wallet and phone had been stripped away with clinical precision. However, as I slid my hand along the inner seam of my trousers, I felt the hard rectangular edge of the encrypted drive still taped to my inner thigh. It was the one place the kidnappers hadn't checked a small mercy in a morning of horrors. I tried to focus on a landmark, but the street signs were a smear of white ink. "Focus, Commander." I whispered the words sounding like dry gravel in my throat. "Horizon heading depth. Focus. Being drugged is like being buried alive in your own skin. You can hear the dirt hitting the coffin lid, but you can't lift your hands to stop it." I watched a police cruiser glide to the curb, its blinding white and blue strobe lights slicing through the San Francisco fog. Immediately behind it, a familiar silver sedan screeched to a halt. All rushed toward me before the officers could even clear their car doors. She was sobbing a high, frantic sound that set my teeth on edge. "Oh, thank God you found him," she cried, her voice carrying the cloying, familiar scent of her expensive perfume as she threw her arms around my unresponsive shoulders. "Dad, why would you leave the house without your coat again? Why would you come all the way here?" I tried to push her away to tell the officers about the beach, the SUV, and the chemical patch on my neck, but my tongue felt like a piece of dead meat. I, I wasn't. She's lying. The water. I slurred the sounds coming out as a rhythmic, nonsensical groan. All turned to the officers, pulling a thick medical file from her bag. "I'm so sorry," she told them, her eyes brimming with a practiced, heartbreaking sorrow. "He has early onset dementia. We've been trying to keep him at home, but he's been prone to wandering, especially since my brother died. He gets confused about the Coast Guard. How do you fight a lie when the liar is wearing your own daughter's face?" The officers nodded in quiet sympathy, their posture softening from suspicious to pitying. They didn't see a decorated commander. They saw a broken old man who had lost his way in the fog. Alar led me to her car with a maternal tenderness that made me want to scream. As she buckled my seatbelt, she leaned in close, the mask of the grieving daughter vanishing for a split second. "The police aren't just here to help. Dad," she whispered in my ear, "I've already filed the first safety concern report with the medical board. It's over. Let's get you to a nice quiet room where you can't hurt anyone else." I shuffled through my front door with the exaggerated shaky gait of a man who'd lost his grip on reality. But behind the mask of docility, my mind was mapping every blind spot in the house, like a sniper prepping a nest, was right behind me, her hand firm on my elbow, guiding me as if I were a piece of fragile porcelain. I let her lead me into the kitchen, keeping my head bowed and my gaze unfocused. Once she had me settled in a chair, she began to move around the room with a clinical efficiency, her face a mask of practiced concern. "I just can't remember where I put my glasses," I muttered, making sure to slur the edges of the words. "It's all so fuzzy." She patted my hand, the cloying scent of her perfume clashing with the bitter chemical smell of the toxin reagent I'd hidden in my palm. "Don't worry, Dad," she said softly. "I'm here now. I'll handle everything. Just drink your water." She poured a glass from my open bottle on the counter and set it before me. I waited until she retreated to the living room to make a phone call. Then I pulled a clandestine detection kit from under my sleeve. I tested the water and the residue in the coffee machine. The strip turned a deep, bruised purple, a high-affinity benzoazepine derivative. It was a professional extractor's tool designed to induce amnesia and disorientation without leaving a trace in a standard toxicology screen. My blood turned to ice when I checked my daily pill organizer. Aara had already replaced my heart medication with inert Placios. She wasn't just waiting for me to fade. She was actively dismantling my physiology to ensure my mental decline was permanent. A home is a sanctuary until the person holding the key wants you dead. I spent the next few hours under the guise of cleaning up moving with a sluggishness that masked my tactical precision. I began installing the micro-aperture high-definition cameras I'd acquired under a shell name weeks ago. I hid them in the smoke detectors, the air vents, and within the spine of a hollowed-out book on the shelf, the tiny needle-sharp lenses were invisible to the naked eye, creating a 360-degree surveillance net. I routed the data through an old Coast Guard satellite bounce to bypass the home IP, address the high-pitched whine of the encryption bridge. A comforting song of resistance in the silent house. How many accidents start with a glass of water and a daughter's worried smile? I moved to the foyer to set the final sensor, looking through the curtains at the street outside. 2 blocks down, a black SUV sat idling, its windows dark. The vultures from Bodega Bay had followed their prey to the city. I returned to the basement, the cool, dry air helping to steady my breathing as I powered up my tablet. "You think I'm the one who's blind?" "Aara," I whispered as the screen flickered to life. But I've never seen more clearly. The grainy blue-tinted light of the monitor showed the house in stark detail. I watched the first live feed catch in the living room. She was no longer crying or acting the part of the devoted daughter. She looked sharp, cold, and utterly detached as she pulled a burner phone from her purse. I watched her lips move, mouthed with a terrifying clarity. Tonight, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The trap was set, and the bait was finally watching the hunters. I lay in the dark, my heart a heavy rhythmic drum against the mattress, waiting for my own daughter to walk through the door and try to kill me. The house was a tomb of silence, or so Aara believed, as she used her emergency key to bypass the deadbolt. At 1 a.m., I didn't reach for my service weapon. Instead, I reached for my phone, watching the eerie green and black flicker of the night vision feed from the kitchen camera, all moved with a practiced, haunting silence. Her face illuminated by the cold blue glow of her own smartphone. I watched her reach for the stove. With the clinical detachment of a scientist, she meticulously turned each gas knob, ensuring the pilot lights were extinguished first, so that the sudden sharp hiss of gas escaping the burners remained uncombusted. She paused for a moment, her ghostly silhouette looking toward my bedroom door, and I felt a soul-crushing betrayal that no storm at sea could ever rival. I soon realized the message I had intercepted earlier wasn't just about the stove. As I monitored the exterior cameras, I saw that the external vents of my house had been taped shut from the outside. They were turning my home into a literal gas chamber. Gas is a patient killer. It doesn't need to strike. It just needs to exist. It fills the lungs like a silent tide rising until there is no room left for the soul. I waited perfectly still as the sharp, rotten egg smell of natural gas began to seep under my bedroom door, thick and suffocating. I heard Aara's car pull away, the gravel crunching beneath her tires like the closing of a casket. Only then did I spring into action. I donned a localized breathing apparatus I had retrieved from the hidden lab. The cold rubber seal of the mask pressing against my face with a reassuring firmness. Is it still murder if the person holding the knife shares your DNA? Or is it just an extension of a failed bloodline? I asked myself, the thought echoing in the hollow space of the mask. I didn't just open the windows. I deployed a heavy-duty industrial fan to clear the air, all while recording the specific gas levels on a digital sensor. I needed proof that the concentration was lethal, a digital receipt for her intent. You didn't even hesitate. Aara, I whispered into the darkness. You just turned the dial. I retreated to the basement to review the full exterior footage, and that was when the final shard of my heart disintegrated. Helping Aara seal the vents was a second figure, Leander Mercer. He was holding a medical bag, the very one that likely contained the sedative used on me in San Francisco. I watched the playback of Leander checking the seal on the bedroom window, his face a mask of predatory boredom. He turned to my daughter and mouthed 3 words that confirmed any mercy I'd been holding on to was a desperate lie. Make it look easy. I sat there in the dark, the breathing mask still hissing, watching the loop of my family preparing my execution. I was no longer just a father or a victim. I was a survivor who had already seen the end of the world and decided to keep walking through the wreckage. I sat in a room that still tasted of sulfur and betrayal, forcing my hands to shake Aara's key turned in the lock, welcoming my would-be executioner back for breakfast. The morning sun hit the kitchen floor where the gas was left running just hours ago, and I had gone through the exhaustive effort of making the house look like the site of a confused, near-fatal mistake. I'd burned 2 slices of bread, filling the air with a smell of burnt toast to mask any lingering scent of methane. When she entered, I greeted her with a hollow, unfocused stare. My shoulders slumped to hide the tactical tension in my frame. I think I left the tea on, I said, my voice thin and trembling. My head, it feels like it's full of wool this morning. I watched her eyes immediately dart toward the stove knob she had turned herself the night before. I saw a momentary flash of frustration in her gaze when she noticed the windows were wide open, a variable she hadn't accounted for in her plan to find a corpse. She pivoted instantly, her face shifting into a mask of maternal concern. Dad, this is the 3rd time this week. she said, her tone sharp with high-pressure gaslighting. You almost blew up the neighborhood. You're not safe here anymore. I reached for a piece of charcoal black toast, my fingers fluttering as if I lacked the strength to hold it. All didn't hesitate. She produced a stack of glossy clinical brochures for a place called the Gilded Pines. I knew the name. It was a high-security memory care facility under the Farm Armacore umbrella, a corporate-owned waiting room for those they needed to disappear quietly. Leander says they have the best doctors, she said, sliding the brochures across the table. Her hand felt like an artificial warmth on my shoulder, heavy and proprietary. You'll be happy there, Dad. No more accidents. I looked down at the pictures of smiling seniors and manicured lawns, realizing the pen she was handing me was unusually heavy. It was a cold metallic weight that felt out of place. My son's research into biometric security flashed in my mind. The pen was a scanner designed to capture my signature and fingerprint simultaneously for an immediate, irrevocable transfer of power of attorney. A daughter's kiss on the cheek can be more lethal than a bullet if her heart is made of ice. She leaned in closer, the rhythmic ticking of the kitchen clock measuring the final seconds of my supposed freedom. How many times had I taught her to be brave, only for her to use that courage to bury her own father? If you think it's best, honey, I whispered, projecting a broken, frightened submission. I just want to stop being so confused. I took the pen and began to sign the voluntary commitment papers. I moved the nib across the page with slow, deliberate precision. I wasn't signing my life away. I was writing in a maritime distress script, a subtle coded variation of my signature that my bank and my personal lawyer were specifically trained to recognize as an authorized signal of coercion. She took the signed papers with a triumphant smile, unaware that the ink on that page was the first step in the legal noose I was tightening around her neck. She stood up already, tucking the documents into her bag as if she were checking off a task on a corporate spreadsheet. We'll get you packed soon, she said, her voice bright with victory. The doorbell didn't just ring. It sounded like a depth charge exploding in the quiet of my hallway, announcing that the legal war for my soul had officially begun. I stood in the foyer, forcing my posture to sag, letting the weight of the previous night's staged trauma show in the lines of my face. When I opened the door, the morning air felt heavy, carrying the low, distant rumble of a city bus passing by. A man in a cheap windbreaker stood there, thrusting a thick envelope toward my chest. I felt the dry paper cut sting on my thumb as I took the petition. The sharp clinical smell of fresh toner on the legal papers wafted up a scent that usually meant order, but now smelled of a meticulously planned execution. I scanned the first page, a formal petition for emergency guardianship and an immediate asset freeze. I looked at the man, making sure to let my hand tremble. I don't understand, I whispered. My voice cracked and small. Why would my daughter do this? The man didn't look like a professional process server. His eyes were hard scanning my hallway for valuables, and his knuckles were scarred. I recognized the type, a low-level enforcer for the same debt collection group Leander owed money to send to intimidate me under the guise of legal service. Just the messenger, sir. He grunted, already turning back to his car. You have a hearing in 72 hours. The heavy, ominous thud of the front door closing behind him punctuated the start of my countdown. I retreated to my study and locked the door. Paper is the only weapon that can kill a man without drawing a single drop of blood. I read through the affidavit signed by Aara and a neutral medical evaluator. They'd used the drugged park bench incident and the staged gas leak as primary evidence of my rapid cognitive decline. It was a perfect trap built on the very crimes they had committed against me. My mind was already dissecting the legal loopholes as I turned to the computer. The blue-white glare of the screen in the darkened study was the only light. As I began to trace the independent medical board complaint that had triggered the state's interest, I reached out to my old Coast Guard contacts, bypassing the surface-level bureaucracy. The digital origin of the complaint led straight to a terminal inside the executive wing of City Hospital. How many lives had Gregory Vance traded for that corner office and a seat on the board of a killer? I found the records I needed. Vance had received over $3 million in consulting fees from farm armacore shell companies over the last fiscal year. So, you're the one who signed my son's death warrant for a bigger bonus. Vance. I muttered my heart, hardening into a cold, predatory focus. I looked closer at the hospital's organizational chart. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening sense of symmetry. Gregory Vance was actually the biological father of the attorney who had handed me the keys to the Bodega Bay estate. The circle of betrayal was complete, stretching from the legal system to the medical board. I looked at the photo of Vance on the screen and realized he wasn't just a corrupt executive. He was the one who had authorized the logistics and security payments to Leander's shell company, 6 months before Silas died. They hadn't just murdered my son. They had commoditized the aftermath. The rain hammered against my windshield like a barrage of small arms fire, a fitting rhythm for the clandestine meeting that would either cement my son's legacy or bury us both in an unmarked grave. I drove through the deluge, navigating the skeletal neon-lit streets of the Mission District until I found the derelict alley Agent Thorne had designated. I pulled up behind a black surveillance-proof SUV that sat idling like a predator in the tall grass. The rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof was a lonely sound. But as I stepped into the back seat of Thorne's vehicle, the world sharpened into focus. Agent Thorne, a former Coast Guard subordinate now carrying the weary authority of an FBI field lead, sat in the driver's seat with his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The air was thick with the scent of damp wool and cold tobacco. In the seat beside me sat the whistleblower, a hollowed-out shell of a man in a rain-soaked parka, his hands buried in his sleeves. Thorne didn't waste time on pleasantries. "This is our chemist," he said, his voice low over the hum of the engine. "He's the reason Silas's cure hasn't been erased yet." The chemist trembled, fumbling with a cheap lighter that flickered orange against his pale skin. "I didn't sign up to be a chemist for a cartel commander," he whispered. He handed me an encrypted drive, his fingers slick with sweat. He revealed that the third voice I'd heard on Silas's final voicemail didn't belong to a hired gun, but to Gregory Vance's chief of staff. It was the proof we needed. The hospital board wasn't just complicit. They were physically present at the scene of the murder. Rain doesn't wash away sins in this city. It just makes them harder to see. Thorne watched the blue light of the laptop reflect off his glasses as he began to cross-reference the chemist's data with Leander Mercer's offshore transactions before I reveal the detail that changes our strategy. Are you still with me? Comment A, if you think Leander is the mastermind, or B, if he's just another pawn, and add one short reason so I can see your perspective. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes. The message is what I hope stays with you. Thorne's face hardened into a mask of lethal resolve. The paper trail is solid, Thane, but we need the voice. We need him to brag about the payout to make this stick in a federal court. He officially authorized a protection detail for the Bodega Bay facility, but the mission for the confession fell on me. I've spent 30 years watching men drown. I told him the metallic cold of the wire device he handed me, feeling like a garrote in my palm. I know exactly how to make a rat talk when the water starts rising. Thorne's SUV was a tiny bubble of justice floating in a sea of corporate corruption, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt the tide starting to turn. As the whistleblower finally pushed back his hood to wipe the rain from his eyes, I froze. The man sitting across from me was the same journalist I had caught photographing my house weeks ago. He hadn't been a threat. He'd been a mole trying to find a way out before the ceiling collapsed. Thorne handed me the wire, a thin coil of copper that felt like a grot. And I knew that the next time I saw Leander, one of us wouldn't be walking away. The safe house smelled of burnt coffee and high-end server racks, a sterile tomb where Thorne began peeling back the layers of a corporate execution plan that read more like a declaration of war than a business strategy. I watched the bluish flickering of multiple server monitors as Thorne's fingers flew across a terminal, the low-frequency hum of a heavy-duty encryption bridge vibrating through the floorboards. We had retreated here to decrypt the neutralization order recovered from the whistleblower, and every line of code that cracked felt like a cold finger tracing my spine. Thorne finally bypassed the last firewall, revealing a memo titled Operation Ghost Tide. It was a tiered strategy. First, the acquisition of my son's research. Second, the neutralization of the researchers. And third, the guardianship of me to secure the physical property. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to slush. The neutralization order even included a contingency for me. If I refused the move to the nursing home, Leander was authorized to use a terminal dose of the same sedative patch staged as a suicide born of my late-stage grief. They didn't just kill him. Thorn, I said, my voice sounding like grinding stones in the clinical quiet. They advertised my son's murder over 2 fiscal quarters. Thorn didn't look up, his face grim and the monitors glow. This isn't a company thing. It's a shark with a law degree. I read further, finding the specific line item for maritime asset disposal. The boating accident hadn't been an act of God or a failure of seamanship. It was a budgeted line item approved by Gregory Vance 6 months before the sails were even raised. Corporate greed doesn't just cut corners. It cuts throats. It turns family dinners into surveillance opportunities and legacies into liabilities. I moved to the tech station where an FBI specialist waited. The smell of ozone and industrial cleaning solution was thick as I stripped off my shirt to allow the technician to apply the equipment. The sticky clinical adhesive of the high-sensitivity wire felt like a brand against my ribs. We calibrated the gain, the specialist adjusting the levels until the rasp of my own breathing sounded like a gale through the headset. Check the gain again, I commanded. I need every breath, every arrogant syllable when Leander admits to it. I practiced the triggers, the verbal cues designed to stroke his ego in the specific distress script. The wire on my skin felt like a cold copper snake, waiting for the right moment to strike. Remember, Commander, the technician said, his eyes meeting mine with professional gravity. If things go south, the word is anchorage. We'll be through the door in 4 seconds. I nodded, already pulling my shirt back on the technical precision of the sting, providing the only anchor for my rage. While Thorn continued digging through the asset disposal folder, a final image popped onto the main screen. It was a grainy black and white funeral surveillance photo showing Leander and Gregory Vance shaking hands near Silas's casket. I leaned in, realizing the metadata showed the photo had been taken by a private surveillance team Aara had hired to watch her own husband. I looked at the funeral photo and realized wasn't just Leander's accomplice. She was his insurance policy, and she had been collecting evidence of his betrayal long before I ever found the key. She wasn't just hiding from the truth. She was weaponizing it for her own survival. I saw the glare of high beams in my rearview mirror, a sudden blinding sun in the midnight fog, and I knew the time for legal games had ended, and the time for survival had begun. I was pushing my truck hard along the serpentine curves of Highway 1, the icy spray of the Pacific, hitting the windshield in rhythmic, violent bursts. The black sedan behind me didn't have its running lights on, just those predatory H-halogen eyes. It surged forward, attempting a professional pit maneuver to send me over the 200-foot drop into the black surf below. Using my Coast Guard heavy vehicle training, I didn't panic. I watched the sedan's front quarter panel shadow mine. Then I slammed the brakes at the exact moment of intended impact. The attacker overshot tires screaming on the salt-slicked asphalt as they fishtailed wildly. "Not tonight, you son of a bitch," I growled, my hands steady on the wheel, not on my watch. I floored the accelerator, taking a narrow fire road shortcut that only locals and rangers knew the smell of burning rubber and hot engine oil filling the cab as I tore toward the hidden facility. I reached down to check on Ren's wheelchair, which I had secured in the back earlier, and my fingers brushed against a small, cold lump of plastic. I pulled it free and realized it was a magnetic GPS tracker. They weren't just following my truck. They were tracking the living patient Zero directly. I arrived at the Bodega Bay estate with the engine ticking from the heat. "Doctor." Sterling was already waiting in the subterranean garage, her face a mask of controlled urgency. She had prepped the 3 remaining children, their small forms bundled against the coastal chill. Tires screamed on the asphalt, a sound like a wounded animal in the dark, but it was distant coming from the main gate. "Commander, they were at the perimeter 5 minutes ago." "Doctor," Sterling said, her voice tight, "we have to move now." We began loading the kids and the portable life support systems into the unmarked armored van Silas had kept hidden for this exact scenario. The rhythmic artificial beep of the children's portable monitors was the only clock that mattered. Now I'm taking them to the old lighthouse station. I told her as I helped Ren into her seat. It's off the grid and federally protected. The armored van was our metal ark carrying the only hope left in a world that wanted to drown it. I felt the heavy, vibrating thud of the van's armored door closing, sealing the children away from the wolves outside. We moved out through the coastal scrub, the pale, ghostly light of the lighthouse appearing in the distance like a beckoning finger. As we reached the secondary safe house doctor, Sterling reached into her pocket and pulled out a small rectangular object. I found this hidden inside the facility's medical fridge. Thane, she whispered, handing me a private keycard embossed with Aara's name. It wasn't just near the data, it was tucked behind the primary cellular samples. I held Aara's keycard, the plastic cold and damning, and realized my daughter hadn't just betrayed Silas. She had been trying to contaminate the samples, attempting to kill the very children he died to save. The betrayal had moved beyond greed. It had become a calculated eraser of everything my son had built. I stood in the center of the silent ward, the copper wire beneath my shirt itching like a guilty conscience, listening for the gravel crunch of a man who thought he was coming to collect an inheritance, but was actually walking into a cage. I checked the adhesive on my ribs one last time, feeling the cold, hidden pressure of the wire against my chest. The children were safe at the lighthouse, and the bait was set. I moved into the library, the dry, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, counting down the seconds of Leander Mercer's freedom. When the front door finally groaned open, I slumped into a leather armchair, a glass of amber liquid in my hand. I made sure the clink of ice against glass was audible, the sound of a broken man seeking solace in a bottle. Leander entered with the confidence of a king, his eyes already scanning the architecture, calculating the square footage for a quick resale. He didn't see a threat. He saw a relic. I'm tired of the fog. Leander, I said, my voice thin and hollow. I'm ready to sign the deeds. I just need to know. Tell me it was quick. Tell me they didn't suffer. Leander poured himself a drink, the predatory gleam in his eyes unchecked. You always were too sentimental. Thane, business doesn't have room for ghosts. He leaned against the mahogany desk, swirling his glass. He actually smiled when he told me was the one who suggested using the blue-flecked nylon rope. She knew Silas wouldn't suspect maritime gear. He chuckled. It's poetic, really. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a son-in-law in a tailored suit, goat-aided by my perceived weakness. His ego took the helm. He mocked Silas and Rhea for being Boy Scouts who tried to disrupt a multi-billion-dollar ecosystem. He described in chilling detail how he used the pharmacy supplies to drug them before tying them to the rigging. He wanted to ensure they went down with the ship while he watched from the powerboat. Silas and Rhea looked at me like I was a monster. Leander continued, his voice dripping with arrogant satisfaction. They begged for each other's lives, but I told them I was just a consultant clearing a debt. The blue rope held just fine. Commander, your son and daughter-in-law's Coast Guard knots were the only things that worked that night. He laughed about the $500,000 Farm Armacore bonus, calling it the easiest money he ever made. How do you sit across from the man who drowned your children and keep your hands from reaching for his throat? I gripped the chair arms until my knuckles turned white, maintaining the facade of a shattered father. I can still see their faces when the water started coming in. Leander said, his eyes glinting with a cruel pleasure. Rhea screamed for Silas. Silas begged me to let her go. But you know what the best part was? They died together. How romantic. He reached into his jacket and produced a syringe, the sharp metallic smell of the surgical needle cutting through the scent of old books. He admitted his plan was never to send me to a nursing home. He was going to administer a terminal dose tonight and claim I died of a broken heart. It was the final piece of the puzzle recorded by a dozen federal ears. Leander stepped toward me, the needle gleaming under the library lights. His face inches from mine. Anchorage is a long way off, old man. He whispered, unaware that he had just spoken the very word that would end his life as a free man. I didn't flinch. I just looked him in the eye and waited for the world to crash in on him. The library windows didn't just break. They disintegrated in a hail of flashbangs and black-clad figures. The sudden violence of the law finally catching up to the silence of my son's murder. I didn't flinch as the blinding white strobe of the diversionary charges turned the room into a fragmented nightmare. Leander's hand froze midair, the needle trembling as his predatory arrogance dissolved into a stuttered, animalistic panic. Federal agents swarmed through the shattered glass, their commands a guttural roar that drowned out the acrid smell of gunpowder and floor wax. Agent Thorne led the stack, moving with a controlled ferocity I remembered from our days on the water. He didn't just detain Leander. He slammed him against the mahogany desk where the man had just been bragging about the easiest money he ever made. "Get on the ground!" Thorne bellowed, the sound of metal meeting wood echoing through the ward. Leander dropped the syringe as if it had turned into a viper, his hands flying up while red laser dots danced across his expensive silk shirt. "Fane, tell them!" He shrieked, his voice cracking into a pathetic weeping wreck. "Tell them it was a joke." I stood perfectly still, a ghost in the middle of a hurricane, watching the man who had tied my son to his own ship crumble into nothing. An on-site technician moved toward the fallen syringe, his eyes widening as he ran a quick field scan. "Commander Ken," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. "This isn't a sedative. It's a concentrated dose of the cellular serum." Leander hadn't just intended to kill me. He wanted to execute me with the very miracle Silas had died to protect. Silence is the loudest sound in a room full of handcuffs. It settled over the library as a second team marched to Aara through the door. They had intercepted her at the perimeter gate, and the metallic clicking of heavy-duty zip ties around her wrists was a sound that cut deeper than any knife. Her mask of clinical detachment had shattered into a wild, manic terror. For a fleeting second, I saw the little girl I used to take fishing, but that ghost was erased when she began to scream. "You think you're a hero, Dad?" she wailed, her high-pitched voice echoing off the acoustic tiles. "You're just a dinosaur protecting a grave. Silas ruined us. He deserved to die for what he was doing to our future." Watching my daughter in chains was like watching my own reflection shatter in slow motion. The betrayal was complete, a total moral collapse, recorded on every microphone taped to my skin. The cold, sharp bite of the winter wind whistled through the broken glass as I turned to Thorne. "Take them out of my sight," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Before I forget, I'm a man of the law." Thorne nodded, signaling the team to haul them out. But Aara reached the threshold. She twisted her head back, a jagged, hideous smile on her face. "You're too late anyway," she spat. "Gregory Vance is already at the lighthouse. He's probably tucking your little miracles in right now." I looked at Thorne, the color draining from his face as his radio crackled with a frantic distress signal. The secure location was no longer secure. The leak had been deeper than we ever imagined, and the shark was finally in the nursery. The smell of industrial bleach and recycled air always felt like a funeral shroud. But as I sat behind the reinforced glass, it was the sight of my daughter in orange polyester that finally broke the last of my maritime resolve. 2 weeks had passed since the raid at the lighthouse, a night that haunted me with the knowledge that Gregory Vance's breach had been nothing more than a lethal feint. Thorne had confirmed my fears days ago. While we were racing to save the children, a remote virus was tearing through the digital server backup I had mirrored. The cure Silas died for was now a fragmented mess of corrupted code. I sat in the high-security visitation wing of the Soma County Detention Center, the low electronic hum of the recording devices in the walls, a constant reminder that every word spoken was a piece of evidence. All looked at me with a hardened bitterness that made my skin crawl. "You look old, Dad," she said, her voice devoid of the warmth I had spent 30 years trying to nurture. "Was saving 3 orphans worth destroying your own blood?" "I didn't destroy this family, Aara," I replied, keeping my tone as flat as a calm sea. "I just stopped the person who was burning it down." She mocked the concept of Silas's hidden clinic, calling him a fool for playing God without a profit margin. Glass is a strange barrier. It lets you see the monster, but it keeps the scent of the blood away. I watched the cold, oily smear of her fingerprints on the glass. As she leaned closer, her eyes flashing with a predatory intent that I finally recognized as her true nature. I remained stoically silent, letting the recorder capture her lack of remorse. Just as I prepared to stand and end the session, she stopped me with a single slow movement. She placed her hand against the glass over her abdomen, her expression shifting into something sickeningly triumphant. "I'm pregnant. Dad," she whispered. 12 weeks. If I go to prison for life, your only grandchild grows up in the system." The news hit me like a rogue wave, a sudden sharp kick of adrenaline that left me breathless. "You're using a life that hasn't even begun to pay for the ones you took," I said, the bitter taste of jailhouse coffee rising in the back of my throat. How many generations of Garrisons have to pay for the sins of one afternoon in the fog? I walked away from the booth without looking back, my boots echoing on the linoleum like a death nail. I climbed into my truck, the rhythmic thumping of the heater fighting the January chill as I sat in the parking lot. I pulled up the audio from the session, intending to verify the recording for Thorne, but as I reviewed the tape, I heard something the room's ambient noise had nearly buried. Aara had been whispering into a hidden wire of her own, a desperate confession to a district attorney she'd been dealing with for weeks. She had been preparing to flip on Leander long before I ever breached the lab. I listened to the tape again, the sound of Aara's secret deal crackling through the speakers, and I realized that in a family of sharks, I was the only one who hadn't learned how to bite until it was too late. I stood in the back of the federal courtroom, watching the high-definition cameras capture the fall of a multi-billion-dollar empire, while the woman I raised was led away in chains. The air in the gallery was thick with the smell of floor wax and old wood, a scent that usually promised stability, but today only underscored the magnitude of the wreckage. Outside, the muffled roar of the crowd sounded like a distant storm surge, a million voices demanding the justice I had spent months hunting in the dark. In the courthouse lobby, the news montages were relentless. The mirrored data I had secured from the Bodega Bay facility had been released by the FBI exposing Pharmarmacor's systematic suppression of pediatric cures. Today's leak confirms that Pharmarmacor put a price on the life of every child in America, a reporter shouted over the den. Protests had erupted globally as the Protocol 7 efficacy rates were verified by independent labs. The corporate board, including Gregory Vance, had been indicted on RICO charges. They didn't just hide a cure, they patented a murder, in a move that stripped the profit from the predators. The federal government seized all of Pharmarmacor's assets and granted the Protocol 7 patents to a nonprofit foundation led by Dr. Mum. Sterling, Silas and Rhea's life's work was finally free for the world, a lighthouse in a sea of corporate greed. Justice is a cold meal served in a room with no windows. The sentencing began with a silence so absolute it felt heavy. Judge Miller, a woman whose face was a map of 60 years of unwavering adherence to the law, stared down at the defendants with a gaze that could wither granite. Leander Mercer was sentenced to life without parole for the double homicide of Dr. Silas Garrison and Dr. Rhea Garrison, as well as corporate espionage. The weight of the evidence, the blue fleck rope, the anchorage recording the blood money left him a hollowed-out wreck in a tailored suit. Aara received 8 to 15 years. Her plea deal was mitigated by her pregnancy and cooperation with investigators, but hardened by the evidence of her attempts to contaminate the medical samples and her role in the gaslighting campaign. The defendant's actions were not a lapse in judgment. They were a calculated erasure of human life for profit. Judge Miller declared, "The gavel strike was the final shot in a war that had no survivors, only witnesses." The echoing hollow thud of the judge's gavel signaled the end. I hope the money was worth the silence. Aara, I thought, as she was escorted through the heavy oak doors toward the holding cells. She didn't look at me until the very last second. As she passed, she dropped a folded piece of paper at my feet with a quick, desperate flick of her wrist. I waited for the blinding flashes of 100 press cameras to subside before I retrieved it. It was a hand-drawn map to a safe deposit box containing Leander's black book, a ledger of every other Dr. Farm Armacore had neutralized over the last decade. It was her final act of insurance, or perhaps a desperate attempt at a legacy for the child she carried. I walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the safe deposit key in my palm feeling heavier than the service pistol I'd carried for 30 years. I gripped the key to the safe deposit box, the cold metal promising a journey into a darkness even deeper than the one I just escaped. The war was over, but the ghosts were only just beginning to speak. The Pacific doesn't forgive, and it certainly doesn't forget. But today the waves felt less like a thresher and more like a heartbeat as I sat on the porch with the morning mail. Several months had passed since the hammer of justice fell in that federal courtroom, and the Bodega Bay estate had finally begun to shed its skin of clinical coldness. The smell of salt spray and wild jasmine carried on the breeze a natural sweetness that was slowly replacing the ghost of antiseptic. I sat on the quiet, salt-stained porch, the warmth of the morning sun on my weathered hands, providing a comfort I hadn't earned in a long time. First letter, July 15th, 2025. I found a stark white envelope in the stack marked with the State Correctional Facility's stamp and a return address that made my breath hitch. The institutional stationery felt rough under my fingers, a tactile reminder of where my daughter now lived. I opened it slowly, the sound of the paper tearing like a small defeat. Dad. I didn't understand the weight of a life until I felt one moving inside me. I'm 12 weeks pregnant now. The doctors say it's a boy. Every kick reminds me that Silas and Rhea were right. Some things aren't meant to be sold. I'm sorry I forgot that. I don't expect you to respond. I just needed you to know that I finally understand what I destroyed. July 15th, 2025. Inside was a grainy ultrasound photo, the first clear image of my unborn grandchild. I stared at the small, curved form tracing the outline of a tiny head and the unmistakable Garrison jawline. I set the letter aside, unable to respond, and placed it in a drawer where it sat like a weight on my conscience. Second letter, October 8th, 2025. 3 months later, another envelope arrived. The handwriting was shakier, more desperate. I opened it, standing on the same porch, the October wind, carrying the scent of salt and decay. Dad, the baby was born last week, October 3rd, 2025. I named him Silas Garrison Mercer after the brother I betrayed. He has his uncle's eyes. I'm allowed to see him twice a week through the prison nursery program. He's healthy, and I'm grateful for that mercy even if I don't deserve it. The nurses say he's strong like his grandfather. I don't know if you'll ever want to meet him, but I needed you to know he exists. He has his uncle and aunt's strength already. Will you meet him someday? October 8th, 2025. A photograph fell from the envelope, a newborn wrapped in a simple white blanket. His tiny fist curled against his cheek, his eyes, Silas's eyes, staring into the camera with an unfocused wisdom. I looked at those eyes and felt my resolve waver, a crack forming in the wall I'd built around my heart. But I still couldn't bring myself to reply. I placed the photo next to the first letter, creating a small shrine to a relationship I didn't know how to repair. The dead don't need apologies. The living need a reason to stay that way. The realization hit me with a profound sense of responsibility. I couldn't save my son and daughter-in-law, and I couldn't save my daughter's soul from the choices she made. But I had been given a third chance to protect the bloodline. You're going to have a better name than the ones we left behind. Little one. I whispered, my voice thick with a dawning hope. The storm is over now. We just have to learn how to walk on the shore. The rhythmic, soothing sound of the tide going out seemed to echo my own internal shift. I made a silent vow that this child would grow up knowing the truth of Silas and Rhea's sacrifice rather than the shadow of Leander's debt. I turned the photo over to look for a date, but my eyes landed on the single line all had written in a careful, trembling script on the back. It was the name she had chosen for the boy. Silas Garrison Mercer. October 3rd, 2025. I turned the photo over and saw my son's name written in my daughter's hand. And for the first time in a year, the fog in my chest finally began to lift. I looked out at the horizon, accepting the burden of a complicated future, ready to be the grandfather my son and daughter-in-law would have wanted me to be. I was kneeling in the dirt, the smell of garden mulch and fertilizer filling my lungs when the mail carrier's truck slowed at the gate, a sound that usually meant bills, but today carried the weight of fresh ghosts. The damp earth of the Bodega Bay estate was a grounding force, a reminder that life continues to churn even when the heart is stalled. I wiped my hands on my canvas trousers and walked toward the mailbox, the distant, mournful cry of a seagull over the cliffs punctuating the heavy silence of the late December afternoon. Third letter, December 24th, 2025. The envelope was thicker this time, arriving on Christmas Eve. I sat on the porch steps, the rough wood biting into my thighs as I tore the paper open with trembling fingers. Inside was both a letter and a small card with a tiny blue handprint pressed into the paper. A gift I hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. Dad, it's Christmas Eve and I'm writing this from a cell that smells like disinfectant and regret. Little Silas smiled for the first time yesterday, December 23rd. The prison counselor told me I need to stop blaming Leander and accept full responsibility for my choices. She's right. I chose to open that gas valve. I chose to turn on my own father. I chose to betray my brother and sister-in-law for money I never even saw. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I've changed. Not because of the bars, but because of him. When he looks at me with those eyes, Silas's eyes, I see everything I destroyed, and I see a chance to do one thing right. Merry Christmas. Dad, I hope yours is warmer than mine. All December 24th, 2025. I held the card with the tiny blue handprint, feeling the wall around my heart soften just slightly. The print was so small, so fragile, a reminder that innocence still existed even in the wreckage of our family. I placed it carefully in the drawer with the other letters, a growing archive of apologies I wasn't ready to accept, but couldn't bring myself to destroy. Fourth letter, December 31st, 2025. 1 week later on New Year's Eve, the final letter arrived. It was the shortest, but somehow the heaviest. I opened it as the sun began to set over the Bodega cliffs, the golden light turning the pages a warm amber. Dad, I know you may never answer these letters. I know I destroyed any right to your love when I betrayed Silas and Rhea. But I'm asking you for one thing. When little Silas is old enough to ask about his uncle and aunt, please tell him they were heroes. Tell him his mother was a coward who learned too late what courage really means. And if you can find it in your heart, tell him about his grandfather, the commander, who never gave up on the truth, even when his own family tried to bury it. I don't deserve redemption, but maybe he deserves to know where he came from. Happy New Year. Dad, I hope it's kinder to you than I was. All December 31st, 2025. I sat on the porch steps on January 2nd, 2026, and opened all 4 letters together, spreading them out in chronological order on the weathered wood. I read them in sequence from the first ultrasound photo to the final plea for my grandson's future, for the first time since the funeral. I wept, not just for Silas and Rhea, but for the daughter I had lost to greed and the grandson I had yet to meet. The house is too quiet for a baby. It's too full of the dead. I moved to place the letters back in their envelopes. But as I adjusted the cheap plastic frame I'd grabbed from the drawer months ago, I noticed a slip of paper tucked into the backing of the ultrasound photo. It was a small handwritten note in Silas's precise script, a coded message I had missed during the initial audit months ago. It was a set of coordinates and a bank routing number for a trust Silas had established before the accident. He knew he had known Aara was pregnant before he died and had already built a fortress of financial protection for this child. I stared at the infant's tiny clenched fist in the photo and realized the true battle for Silas and Rhea's legacy wasn't fought in a lab or a courtroom. It was starting right now in a nursery I wasn't prepared to build. I stood up the melancholy of the morning, replaced by a familiar, disciplined resolve. It was time to go back to the facility and claim what was mine. How do you write a letter to a woman who tried to turn your home into a gas chamber when she's the only gatekeeper to the boy who carries your son's face? I sat at Silas's heavy mahogany desk, the absolute ringing silence of the estate's high-tech library, pressing against my ears like the weight of deep water. A blank sheet of heavy bond paper lay before me, mocking the decades of command decisions I had made without a second thought. I picked up the fountain pen, and the rhythmic scratch of the nib on the page sounded like a keel scraping against jagged rock in a blind fog. Before I began to write, I reviewed the decrypted files one final time. I discovered a hidden page at the very end of the neutralization order that I had somehow overlooked. It was a cold clinical directive to protect the Garrison bloodline at all costs if the parents failed. Farm Armacore hadn't just wanted to kill Silas. They viewed his unborn son as their ultimate intellectual property, a living patent they intended to harvest and control for the next generation. This child was the final prize in their twisted corporate balance sheet. I will take the boy. I wrote my hand steady with a blunt maritime honesty. Not because you asked, but because he deserves a name that isn't a prison sentence. I made the terms of our future clear. The clinic stays closed. The research remains with the foundation, and the boy stays with me. I sealed the envelope, the sound of the adhesive sticking feeling, like the final locking of a steel bulkhead before a massive world storm. A pen is a small thing to hold when you've spent a lifetime holding the wheel of a heavy cutter in a gale. It carries a different kind of weight, one that doesn't just navigate the waves, but shapes the shore. I walked out of the house and down toward the edge of the cliffs, the salt-heavy wind whipping through my gray hair and stinging my eyes with the spray of the Pacific. I stood there for a long time, watching the rhythmic, thunderous crash of the tide against the rocks below, near the dark spot where the blue-flecked rope had once held fast. Peace isn't the absence of war. It's the presence of a better reason to fight. I realized then that my thirst for vengeance had finally evaporated, replaced by a quiet, predatory, protective instinct that was far more dangerous to my enemies. I wasn't the same man who had first turned that brass key months ago. I was something harder, a guardian forged in the very fog that had tried to swallow my family. I'm ready for the quiet now. Silas. I whispered into the cold metallic smell of the ocean mist. But I'll be ready for the noise too, if they ever dare to come back for what belongs to us. I looked back at the house, a fortress I had already begun to rearm in the shadows. I had reactivated the subterranean defenses and the drone net, turning the estate into the most fortified nursery on the Pacific coast. Welcome home, little Silas. The thought was a warm, heavy anchor in my chest. I looked out at the horizon where the sun was finally cutting through the stubborn gray. Knowing that the child arriving tomorrow wouldn't just be a Mercer or a Garrison, he would be the storm that finally cleared the air for all of us. I turned my back to the sea and walked toward the gate, ready to meet the future on my own terms. I pressed my hand against the cool glass of the command center's main display, watching a constellation of blue dots ignite across the globe, each one representing a clinic where my son and daughter-in-law's stolen miracle was finally being given away for free. The data scrolling across the screen told the story and numbers 150 children treated across 30 international sites in just 6 months since the Foundation's official opening. The Protocol 7 success rate remains steady at 87%, validated now by independent research teams from Johns Hopkins to the Karolinska Institute. The hum of global data servers vibrated through the floorboards, a steady rhythmic pulse that felt like the breathing of a living thing. I stood at the center of the Garrison Foundation's new operational hub, an irony that brought a grim smile to my face. We had built this sleek glass and steel headquarters, directly atop the renovated subterranean ruins of Silas and Ria's original hidden lab. The very shadows where they had fought their secret rebellion had become the luminous center of a public revolution. Beside me, Dr. Lean Sterling moved with a focused intensity, her hands dancing across a console as she coordinated with medical liaison in Berlin and Tokyo. The digital mirror I had fought so hard to create was no longer a secret weapon. It was a public utility, rendering the corporate neutralization order a pathetic relic of a defeated era. Doctor. Sterling appeared beside me, her tablet glowing with the latest clinical trial results. Thing. The National Cancer Institute just approved Phase 2 expansion. She said, her voice thick with emotion. We can scale to 300 patients by next quarter. Ren is officially 18 months tumor-free. She's asking when she can visit the ocean. I nodded, watching the young patient, now 8 years old, through the glass partition of the observation room. She was playing with building blocks. Her laughter, a sound I'd thought I'd never hear again after Edith died. We aren't just treating patients. Thane, doctor, Sterling said earlier, her voice catching with the same bittersweet triumph I felt. We're breaking the back of the industry that tried to bury them. I nodded, watching the data flow. Silas and Rhea didn't want a monument. Leanne, they wanted a future. I think we finally gave them one. A legacy isn't written in ink or blood. It's carved into the lives of the people who survive because of you. Outside, the Foundation's flag snapped in the coastal wind, and I had personally ensured that the halyard was made of the same blue-flecked nylon rope that had once been used to destroy my family. Now it held the symbol of their salvation. I left the hum of the servers behind, driving out to the secluded cliffside cemetery, where Silas and Rhea lay side by side. The rhythmic, soothing roar of the Pacific followed me up the path, a constant companion that no longer sounded like a threat. I carried a heavy physical copy of the Foundation's first annual report and a laminated photo of baby Silas, kneeling in the grass. I felt the cool, grainy texture of the granite headstones beneath my palms as I cleared away the salt-encrusted lichen and fresh cemetery lies. The ocean is a graveyard that never closes. But today, the water looked like hope. Mission accomplished. Silas, Rhea, I said, my voice low and steady. The report of a commander to his finest officers. The kids are safe. Your boy is healthy. The world knows both your names for the right reasons now. I'll see you both in the next life. Until then, I'll keep the watch. I stood up the wind whipping through my hair and noticed something I had missed when I arrived. Resting on Silas's headstone was a single fresh white rose. It was the unmistakable signature of the whistleblower, a silent signal that the dark network was still out there, watching over the Garrison legacy from the shadows. I turned back toward the car where little Silas was waiting in his seat, his wide eyes catching the golden light of the setting sun. As I opened the door, I noticed he was clutching a small object with infant intensity, the same silver compass Silas had carried on the day of the storm. The needle was steady, pointing true north, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where we were going. The sand was cold beneath my boots, a familiar grit that had grounded me through every storm. But today, the ocean didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a conversation. I walked slowly along the Bodega Bay shoreline, the rhythmic low roar of the Pacific acting as a steady bass note to the light splashing of the tide. Little Silas, now a toddler with the Garrison jawline and a quiet, watchful intensity in his blue eyes, clutched his father's silver compass, as if he already understood the weight of the heading. I carried him for a while, pointing out the way the orange and violet hues of the Soma sunset danced across the white caps. The smell of salt spray and damp kelp was thick in the air, a scent that once reminded me of loss, but now only spoke of endurance. The water takes what it wants, little one, I said softly, my voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had finally seen the end of a long campaign, but it always leaves something behind on the shore. I watched his small fingers trace the cold silver weight of the heirloom compass, the needle vibrating slightly before settling true north. I had recently finalized the paperwork to deed the entire Bodega Bay estate to a specialized trust. It was no longer my fortress. It was now a permanent sanctuary for the survivors of Protocol 7, ensuring the land that saw so much blood became a home for the children Silas and Rhea had died to save. Forgiveness is a slow tide. It doesn't happen all at once, but eventually the jagged edges of the rocks are worn smooth. I felt that smoothing now, a deep reconciliation with the man I had been and the man I had to become. Steady as she goes, I whispered as I set the boy down on the cool, shifting texture of the wet sand. You've got the helm now. He didn't stumble. He simply stood there, watching the waves with a reflective depth that mirrored his namesake. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old Coast Guard commander's coin, the metal worn smooth by years of nervous habit. It represented a lifetime of following orders, of tactical rigidity, and of a war that had finally reached its conclusion. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a final brilliant flare of gold across the water, I tossed the coin into the deep. I watched it vanish into the foam, a final resignation from my role as a soldier of the past, so that I could finally be a shepherd for the future. I didn't feel the loss of it. I felt the lightness of a mission completed. The silence that followed wasn't the empty kind that had haunted my house for years. It was a ringing, vibrant peace. I reached down and took the boy's hand, holding the compass that once belonged to both his father and mother. And together we turned away from the water to walk home, carrying their legacy forward. I stood at the water's edge, the compass needle in the boy's hand, settling true north, and realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the storm. I was simply standing in the light. The cycle of the tides would continue, but the Garrison legacy was no longer a story of secrets and shadows. It was a heading clear and unwavering cut into the horizon. The boy looked up at me, his small voice barely audible over the waves. "Grandpa, where are we going?" I smiled, the first genuine smile in what felt like years, and knelt down to his level. "Home, little Silas. We're going home. And tomorrow I'll tell you all about your father and mother, the two bravest people I ever knew." I stood up, lifting him onto my shoulders, and we walked together along the shoreline as the last light of day faded into the deep blue of evening. Behind us, the waves continued their eternal rhythm, washing away footprints, but never the memory of those who had walked before us. Looking back now, I realized the hardest truth was not discovering the conspiracy or facing the men who killed my son. The hardest truth was admitting that I ignored the warning signs inside my own home. I trusted blood more than character, and that nearly cost innocent lives. If there is one lesson from my family story, it is this: love should never blind you to truth. A real family story is not defined by loyalty at any cost, but by the courage to stand for what is right, even when the enemy shares your name. And if this family story proves anything, it's that silence can sometimes be more dangerous than betrayal. I also learned something painful about revenge. What began as a dad revenge mission slowly became a responsibility to protect the future. True dad revenge is not about destruction. It's about defending those who cannot defend themselves. In the end, the real meaning of dad revenge was making sure my son's sacrifice saved lives instead of disappearing into darkness. If I could give you one piece of advice, it would be this: never ignore the quiet unease in your heart when something feels wrong. Pride, denial, and blind love can build the perfect shelter for betrayal. I believe God sometimes allows us to walk through the darkest storms so we can finally see the truth in the light. Thank you for walking with me all the way to the end of this journey. I'd really like to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you discovered the people closest to you were hiding something this dangerous? Share your perspective in the comments. If this story moved, you consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories like this one. A small note: while this narrative draws inspiration from real-world themes and human conflicts, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this type of story isn't your preference, feel free to explore other videos that may suit you better.